Monolith Soft is quickly becoming one of Nintendo's biggest and honestly most important studios. They've been progressively expanding in staff, having effectively doubled in the last 5 years or so, and multiple studio spaces and locations have been purchased to facilitate all of that. But why did they do all of that? What's going on at Monolith Soft? What games can we expect to see them release in the coming year and the years that follow? Let's talk about it. This video was made possible by everybody who went down and clicked the like button on our last video to hit that 250 like benchmark that I set when saying I would make this video. I think it would be awesome if we could possibly even beat that. There's still plenty of studios that we could talk about in depth and full-on games that every one of these studios could be working on that we can make videos that we talk about them in detail. But that's for later. What I want to do now is give a brief rundown on Monolith Soft and their history pre-Nintendo. Monolith Soft was founded in 1999 by former Squaresoft employees as a result of Square no longer allowing them enough creative freedom. They felt Square was needlessly prioritizing established IP over new ones as a result of Final Fantasy's spike in popularity after the release of Final Fantasy VII. Shortly after being founded and having shares up for grabs, Namco invested most in Monolith due to their shared values, and with that investment, Monolith Soft became a Namco subsidiary. Under Namco, Monolith Soft developed the Xenosaga series for the PS2 and a spin-off title for mobile phones in Japan, which, and stop me if this sounds familiar, was created as a spiritual successor of sorts to the Xenogears that they developed for the original PlayStation under the Squaresoft umbrella. Sometime after the release of their next project, following the first couple Xenosaga games, which was a tactical RPG crossover game called Namco Cross Bandai, Monolith's relationship with Namco began to sour. Their following releases were almost entirely released on Nintendo platforms, including, but not limited to, a port of the first two Xenosaga games, Baten Kaitos Eternal Wings and the Lost Ocean, and its prequel, Baten Kaitos Origins. These games clearly piqued the interest of higher-ups over at Nintendo because soon after the release of these games, Satoru Iwata approached Monolith Soft to work on a new release in the Mother series. Obviously, this pitch never made it into full-on production as it was rejected by Shigesato Itoi, but it certainly was indicative of Monolith's standing with Nintendo. In the years that followed, Namco merged with Bandai to become Namco Bandai, or what we know now as Bandai Namco. This merger ultimately resulted in the newly formed Namco Bandai becoming more and more averse to risks, and therefore Monolith Soft being in a similar predicament to when they originally broke off from Squaresoft. Thankfully, executives over at Nintendo valued Monolith's desire to innovate, and it was at that point that they decided to break off from Namco Bandai, leading Nintendo to purchase a majority stake in Monolith, with Namco Bandai still retaining 16%. Coincidentally, this acquisition is also partially responsible for the strong relationship Nintendo and Bandai Namco have today, but again, different video for another day. There's other nitty-gritty game releases, but for the sake of time, the most important thing to note in the interest of this video's purposes from the early days of Monolith becoming a Nintendo first party is the fact that they've been tapped by Nintendo to provide support on some of their biggest projects since the days of Super Smash Bros. Brawl. And that continues to this day with their latest completed support dev project being Animal Crossing New Horizons, and their most notable current project being the sequel to The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, as they had with the original game. For Breath of the Wild, Monolith Soft's work seemed to mostly amount to the environmental execution of the open world, meaning the landscape of the game's map was largely done by Monolith, which makes sense given their pedigree with massive game maps. We'll get to that in a bit. So I think their inclusion in the development team for the sequel means they'll likely be doing similar work there. My thoughts would be that Nintendo wouldn't need to tap Monolith to work on the sequel of Breath of the Wild unless they plan to expand the existing world into something bigger with the sequel. My assumption would be that'll net out to be underground areas like the one we saw in the initial teaser trailer for the sequel, and maybe that'll also mean we'll get underwater exploration, or potentially they'll go to the sky. Either way, I feel confident that Monolith's involvement in the sequel indicates a world that is on some level more ambitious than what is seen in the original Breath of the Wild. While even just supporting the development of a game like Breath of the Wild is sure to be a massive undertaking, it's important to note that Monolith Soft is a multi-team, multi-branch studio with locations in Tokyo and Kyoto, Japan, which allows for them to take on support roles from major Nintendo releases and still maintain their own internal projects, much in the way they did this year with Animal Crossing New Horizons and the definitive edition for Xenoblade Chronicles. It's for that reason that I think at bare minimum, Monolith Soft is working on one of their own games in addition to their support role on Breath of the Wild sequel. And I want to run some of them by you, starting with a definitive edition for Xenoblade Chronicles X. The concept of a Nintendo Switch Xenoblade Chronicles X port has been floated since before the Switch was even officially released, so it's not surprising to me that the topic came up in a US Gamer interview with Monolith Soft head Tetsuya Takahashi. In this interview, Takahashi suggested that this port was unlikely due to it being too expensive to make given the scope of Xenoblade Chronicles X. I think in 2018 when this interview was conducted, this comment made a lot of sense. Xenoblade was growing in relevance and quickly becoming one of Nintendo's most important JRPG franchises to be sure, but there wasn't much proof in the pudding there just yet. Sure, Xenoblade 2 had released in this time, and that game showed the series had grown, but it was still pre-Smash Ultimate and the definitive edition of Xenoblade Chronicles on the Nintendo Switch released, which both further improved the rep and awareness of the series around the world. So I fully believe the increased cost would be warranted here, especially if plans would then move forward on the next possibility, Xenoblade Chronicles X2. Around the time of that US Gamer interview, other notable Monolith employees were pushing for a Xenoblade Chronicles X sequel, and I think that has a lot of potential to be very successful for them pending the outcome of a Xenoblade Chronicles X Switch port. I think Xenoblade X could appeal to an even wider audience than the original game, given its more modern take of the world and the whole giant transforming robot thing it has going on. Also, I think Xenoblade Chronicles X caught my attention more personally, despite not being all that big of a fan of the original, because I like the prospect of creating my own character, and the ability to play online multiplayer was also interesting to me. Being able to do all of that in a sequel could get me back in, even though admittedly I felt burned by the original's hefty requirements to finally pilot a Skell or mech. Honestly, I feel a sequel could fix the problems I had with that, and if it does, I would be more than happy to play through that. Finally, for the topic of Xenoblade, a new addition to the mainline Xenoblade Chronicles franchise, or Xenoblade Chronicles 3, is also surely in the works. I'd imagine they'll want to veer a bit from Xenoblade Chronicles 2 in the same way that game veered away from the original Xenoblade Chronicles and Xenoblade Chronicles X, while also taking place in the same universe. I'd be interested to see what in particular they do with it, but I'm sure it'll retain their battle system with a few tweaks that incorporate whatever the new story focus is, akin to the Monado or the Blades in prior games. Perhaps the most mysterious thing of everything else in this video is the new IP that Monolith Soft teased in the lead up to Xenoblade Chronicles 2's release, a medieval action RPG that they described as being ambitious. All we have to go off from that is some concept art, and really the only thing this tells me is it's unlikely to have Xeno whatever in the title. I'm not even entirely sure what they could mean by ambitious. Is it the size of the world? Is it a new, more involved battle system? Is it an even bigger story endeavor? Is it a combination of all of these things? I'm not sure, but I'd be surprised if we don't get an update in 2021 with more concrete details. As I mentioned, Baten Kaitos is one of the early non-Xeno franchises developed by Monolith Soft. Unfortunately though, it turns out that Bandai Namco retained the rights to it, and that's the primary reason we haven't seen them work on a new game since their acquisition by Nintendo. In fact, one of the inciting incidents in Monolith leaving Bandai Namco was the canning of a DS project for a brand new Baten Kaitos game Monolith wanted to release. It was mentioned that it would be possible to bring back the series even now, given substantial fan feedback encouraging Bandai Namco Entertainment to allow them to use the franchise again. I think, given the relationship between Nintendo and Bandai Namco in tandem with Nintendo's faith in Monolith, it wouldn't surprise me if they could get the green light from them regardless of the fan fervor behind it, or even if Nintendo outright purchased the rights to the franchise altogether if Monolith really wanted it enough. Personally, I played the original game maybe once on my aunt's GameCube around when it came out in the early 2000s, and it didn't really stick with me, but I wouldn't be opposed to try it out if it was ported to Nintendo Switch, or if they made a new game altogether. More importantly than that though, I want it for the people that know they would enjoy it, and for the fans of the original games. If you're a fan of the series, feel free to tell me what makes it great in your opinion. Ironically, this is probably the least likely possible project from Monolith, but hey, Iwata did specifically point to Monolith to make a new Mother game, and I for one want to see what he thought they could bring to the series. Maybe they can start with a port of the trilogy in a similar way many classic franchises are handed off to new development teams in the modern era. After that though, I want to see them try to make a fourth Mother title with new ideas to continue to push that series forward, as I think Mother has the potential to become a massive franchise in the modern era if Nintendo and co put in the effort to make it that. I don't know if Itoi has since changed his tune, and maybe that could make this a possibility, but hey, the Mother franchise's 35th anniversary is a good opportunity for them to give Monolith a shot, and it's not that far away, just saying.
Well, this is quite a role reversal, me chiming in on this topic on AJ's video, where he's talking about a JRPG dev and I'm going to talk about his thing. But let's chat about Pokemon. AJ is talking about what's likely to happen from Monolith Soft, but I'm going to throw caution to the wind and say that I hope they're using their expertise to support Game Freak and the Pokemon Company in the development of the next mainline Pokemon game. Ultimately, many of us want what we colloquially call the Breath of the Wild of Pokemon, turning it into more streamlined, open world kind of experience that's more representative of the Pokemon world as we really imagine it. Well, I think that especially since Game Freak recently moved to the same office area as Nintendo, it's likely that they could be doing so for further collaborative opportunities. Game Freak is really quite new to developing HD games and had to make leaps from the 240p screen of a 3DS to the 720 or 1080p on a Switch. It's no surprise their games aren't wowing us right out the door, but where I'd really like to see Monolith Soft integrate their experience here is in the way their worlds are large, grandiose, but well orchestrated and organized, and specifically that the creatures that inhabit these areas feel rooted and grounded in the context. We saw a bit of this in the wild area where some higher level Pokemon would appear even before you're ready for them. It's something about the way they spawn in and always in the same place and wander aimlessly doesn't have the same impact as a level 91 T-Rex looking guy wandering around plains that you first encounter at level 10. And this, of course, is only one example. Hopefully they could take even more cues from their time with Breath of the Wild and integrate just some of the amazing AI found in the monsters roaming Hyrule. Moblins throwing Bokoblins, Bokoblins having little camps and dance sessions, and you get the picture. These are things that even if Monolith wasn't directly behind these contributions, they likely have some experience supporting them, which I would love them to bring over to support my OG game franchise, Pokemon.
And that's all of the projects that we know for sure Monolith Soft is working on, some that are pretty plausible and others that would just be fun given their pedigree. Let us know which one of these would you be the most excited to see announced? What other ones that we didn't talk about could also be fun ideas? And are there any that we missed? Let us know that and more in the comments down below. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click the like button and subscribe for new videos like this every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Okay, that's it for me. See you Thursday.